The Catcher in the Rye by William O'Keefe. Music is Painted Black by the Rolling Stones. The story is centered around one main character named Holden Caulfield. The story about uncontrollable emotions felt by a teenager that are either unnoticed or ignored by others around him. A story about repressed feelings, feeling alone, and unknowingly being depressed and acting out. Thoughts on The Catcher in the Rye. Despite being written half a century ago, The Catcher in the Rye, written by J.D. Salinger, is an undying novel that still captivates today's generation of readers. It is a very enlightening story about a teenager from a privileged family who is coming of age and dealing with loss with nobody to rely on. The story is told in an easy reading and yet serious and sensitive way, as it elicits the reader's attention to a young man in deep internal emotional turmoil who needs help to deal with this throughout the entire book, yet no one seems to pick up on this need. The writer draws our attention to the serious issues surrounding adolescence depression and our need as a society to be catchers in the rye by looking out for one another in this world where we can all be so very misunderstood in our cries for help by people too busy to notice or ignorant about mental health. The Catcher in the Rye is definitely an educational book that everyone should take the time to read, especially today, where mental health issues are more prevalent than ever. Synopsis. Holden Caulfield, the narrator, is a 16-year-old teenager who has a hard time dealing with all aspects of his life from engaging in school to controlling his impulses, as he is dealing with all alone with the trauma of his brother Ali's death. After his brother's death, and yet right before a tumultuous time for many who suffer with depression, in and around the Christmas holiday season, Holden Caulfield is kicked out for the fourth time from a string of prestigious East Coast prep schools. While very vulnerable and on the brink of a psychiatric breakdown, the prep school student suddenly leaves his school a couple days before Christmas break while in the middle of the night without a word to anyone. The narrator takes readers on an unpredictable and yet self-destructive 48-hour escape around New York City, which first starts with him checking into a cheap New York hotel room. The book is written in a way that truly demonstrates Holden's path of self-destruction. During his 2 days before having to face his parents about being kicked out of yet another prep school, Holden demonstrates many concerning actions to the reader, such as excessive drinking, going to bars, smoking, sleeping on park benches in Central Park, having an encounter with a random woman, getting beaten up by a pimp, and generally continuing to lead the bad boy life with no intention of ever going back home again. Along the way, Holden also has encounters with people who should have seen his cries for help, but did not. These are nuns, an old girlfriend, his sister, as well as an old friend of his. At one point, Holden also seeks help from a former English teacher that he respected, yet the teacher exploits Holden's visible vulnerability by making inappropriate advances toward him. The book concludes with Holden eventually going home and the suggestion that Holden is obtaining psychiatric help, where he then expresses optimism about going to another school in the fall. Themes overview. One of the main themes in The Catcher in the Rye is dealing with loss, how some individual/teenagers go about coping with tragedy in wrong ways, and explores fundamental themes related to adolescence, coping with death, teenage sexuality, not understanding the effects of mental health on individuals. The author takes a more in-depth look into teenage isolation and depression by exploring the behavior of a young teenager in the midst of turmoil over the death of his brother. Another main theme of the book is to make everyone look at themselves as individuals who can also help others be like catchers in the rye. By this, the author is advocating to the need for everyone in society to look out for one another and be there for each other in an effort to not let anyone fall around us. This includes falling into states of isolation, falling into states of depression, generally falling into wrong paths, smoking, alcohol, sex, and rebellion against authority, etc. Introduction. Holden views all adults that surround him as simply being full of flaws, phoniness, and generally being letdowns for him during his time of need. Generally, society has come to somewhat accept flaws and phoniness in adults, but these are actually unacceptable traits that perpetuate many adults not feeling generally responsible for others or even for themselves at times. It also leads to them having a sense of entitlement and selfishness, and this is the case with Holden's parents, his prep school friends, and even his prior teachers. Sometimes adolescents such as Holden, who are struggling with emotional issues or loss, and who are surrounded by such flawed and phony individuals, struggle with depression and isolation by having no true, real, and responsible people to turn to in emotional times. Thesis. The Catcher in the Rye explores adolescence through Holden Caulfield, a teenager dealing with depression and isolation who suffers from not having any support from anyone around him, including his parents, friends, teachers, after the death of his brother Ali. Holden Caulfield's parents. Holden's parents are simply too preoccupied with their own lives to notice their own son's needs emotional support after the death of Ali, their son and Holden's brother. Holden's parents don't make provisions for Holden to get any sort of counseling to help deal with the psychological trauma of Ali's death. It is as if his death is just swept under the rug without any further thought, with everyone in the family just moving on in life as usual. Mr. Caulfield is a successful, wealthy, and prominent lawyer who is too self-absorbed to ever have a relationship with his son, Holden. In keeping with the being self-absorbed and ignorant of the psychological problems his own son is dealing with, Holden's dad sends him off to boarding school and threatens to send him that goddamn military school. As for Holden's mother, she hasn't felt too healthy since Ali died. She is very nervous. As such, Holden felt he had to keep things to himself to protect his mother from any more stress in her life, even though all of this was truly affecting him psychologically. He needed someone to talk to, but didn't feel his parents were available to him. His father was too self absorbed to notice, and his mother was too distraught by the loss of her son, Ali, to deal with her son and be available for him to speak to and lean on. As he is embarrassed about his overall behavior, getting kicked out of prep school a fourth time, and can't count on his parents to be there for him, Holden decides to go off on a bender in New York City for a couple of nights. He goes out to the bars, gets drunk, meets up with a hooker and her pimp, gets beat up, insults an old friend, contacts an old girlfriend in the middle of the night, sleeps on a park bench, and generally thinks about killing himself as he is feeling so lonesome all of a sudden he almost wished he was dead. Emotional neglect is a failure of the primary caregiver to provide adequate nurturing and affection to a child. Because emotional neglect is mostly silent and invisible, childhood emotional neglect is largely overlooked in psychology. Unlike physical neglect or abuse, where there are signs such as bruises, emotional neglect is difficult to identify, as there are frequently no observable signs. Most importantly, emotional neglect is generally unrecognized by the child until symptoms begin to appear in adulthood. Holden's teachers. Holden's teachers are people who are supposed to be in a trust position, and people in such positions usually have heightened social awareness. They are also the people who students often turn to when things are not going well, either at school or at home. They are often the medium between students and their parents, but when all of these avenues fail Holden, he is then left on a train of self destruction, delving deeper into depression and isolation. First, we have Mr. Spencer, an old history teacher who assumes the only reason Holden does so poorly in school is because he doesn't try hard enough. He doesn't even try to see what else could be going on with Holden to account for his poor performances, and makes no effort to get to know any more about the troubled student. In fact, Mr. Spencer makes things worse for young Caulfield by making him read out loud the history exam he failed, and acts like it is no surprise that Holden would be getting kicked out of this school, considering he was already kicked out of other prep schools. Mr. Spencer then annoys Holden even more by preaching to him about his parents being very nice and grand people. He is also he also preaches about life being a game and all, and how you should play it according to the rules. Nevertheless, Holden just has no connection with the teacher and regrets going to say goodbye to him. Boy, can't imagine how sorry I was getting that I'd stop by to say goodbye to him. A conversation that Holden should have found to be beneficial for him went bad, with Holden expressing that it was like he'd just beaten the hell out of me in a ping pong or something. He also expresses that his conversation with Mr. Spencer made him sound dead or something. It was very depressing. The second teacher, Mr. Antolini, is the opposite of Mr. Spencer. He is a young English teacher that Holden knows from one of his previous schools, and had a good sense of humor and all. And he could kid around with without losing his respect for him. He even recalled that Mr. Antolini was the only teacher considerate enough to pick up the body of a boy who committed suicide at one of his former schools. This thought of suicide alone makes Holden contemplate his own destructive thoughts and suicidal idolations. After talking to Phoebe and Ali, Holden is even more disturbed and feels as though he has nowhere to go on his second night in New York. He therefore calls on his trusted and respected teacher, Mr. Antolini, who invites him to spend the night at his home. The young teacher takes time to listen to Holden and assures him that many, many men have just as troubled morally and spiritually as he was right now. However, the trusted teacher then also exploits Holden's traumatic life situation. As soon as he falls asleep on the couch, the student is awakened with what he perceives as a homosexual advances by his old teacher. He quickly runs out of the apartment to save himself from yet another traumatic experience. This leads Holden into even further depression and isolation, as the more he thought about it, thought the more depressed and screwed up he got about it. His overall psychiatric state appears to spiral downwards in the morning after his life-changing experience, where he feels he can no longer trust anyone to help him. He is then aimlessly walking along Fifth Avenue, imagining being alone for the rest of his life, and even imagining suicide, where he would be sucked in by the road and just go down, 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 and nobody would ever see him again. He also wouldn't have any goddamn stupid, useless conversations with anyone. Holden's friends. Holden's friends also add to his feelings of depression and isolation by ignoring his situation and not no acknowledging of his good nature. Holden gets as far as agreeing to write an English essay for his roommate, Ward Stradler, later. After being kicked out of his prep school, Ward then just ends up hating him in the hating Holden's essay and telling him this rather than appreciating the fact that he had done anything for him in the first place. Instead of being grateful, Strad was angry and unknowingly disrespectful as he said, "For Christ's sake, Holden, this is about a goddamn baseball glove." Stradler did not like the topic of even though it was all about his dead brother baseball glove, which was very sentimental for Holden. To add to the misery, Holden wrote the essay for his roommate as he went out on a date with Jane Gallagher, a girl Holden knew from before. His roommate left with the essay and even took Holden's new hound's jacket without asking to borrow it, therefore again showing no respect for Holden at all. Stradlater shows no empathy for Holden's grief and loss of a beloved brother. He shouts, "No wonder you're flunking the hell out of here. You don't do one damn thing the way you're supposed to. I mean it. Not one damn thing." Stradlater also insinuates that he had sex with Jane, which is someone Holden appears to have feelings for himself. Holden then gets into a fight with his roommate about it, and he ends up getting a bloody nose. After the fight, Holden leaves his dorm room to get away from Stradler, but is in an effort to seek support. He heads on to next door, where Robert Ackley's room is. However, Ackley essentially pushes him away by asking him, "Do you know what time it is, by any chance?" and claiming that he needs to go to sleep because he's got to get up and go to Mass in the morning, for Christ's sake. Ackley also refuses to let Holden sleep in his room, roommate's Ellie's bed, even though he knows that Ellie will not be coming back until Sunday night, telling Holden, "I'd hate it if like hell if Ellie came in all of a sudden and found some guy." Holden often welcomed Ackley to his room in the past, even though he is a very per, peculiar guy himself. However, when Holden needed someone to talk to that night, a couple minutes later, Ackley was soaring like mad. Being so unappreciated and ignored by both Stradler and Ackley, Holden feels so lonesome and rotten. Holden got angry at being ignored and isolated from his own supposed friends, and upon deciding to leave, he yelled at the top of his lungs, "God, some voice. Sleep tight, you morons." As things snowballed and the weight of the world appeared to be on Holden's shoulders, nobody to lean on for support during this difficult time, he decides to leave the prep school grounds all alone in the middle of the night, kind of crying, and goes to a cheap New York hotel because he feels so lonesome and also wishes he was dead. In conclusion, Holden Caulfield is an example of an adolescent whose actions and behaviors are the result of his unsurmountable and overwhelming emotional distress that he is feeling after his death of his brother Ali. He simply isn't dealing with or coping with the death of his brother and is truly very alone while trying to balance his emotions without help from friends, family, other trusted individuals. He is also trying to continue on with his life without help from psychiatric professionals. In keeping with the usual teenage problems, Holden is thrown a curveball, having to find his way to cope with his brother's death. In a world without support for Holden, it is no wonder that as a teenager he is emotionally equipped to handle such an amount of emotional distress. This is what led him to go into downward spiral of depression and isolation. Um, Unfortunately, this is all still too prevalent today, and this is why we all need to become catchers in the rye, looking out for one another and being there for one another when we fall. At one point in our lives, we all need to support the support of other people to help us through our own personal problems, our personal tough times. As adults, it is that much more important to be aware of our surroundings in an effort to compensate for young teenagers who may not know what they are dealing with when spiraling downward psychiatrically. Discussion questions. Question 1. How are we as individuals to notice when someone is spiraling into depression and isolation? Question 2. The book was written more than 60 years ago. Are psychiatric conditions any easier to deal with today? Question 4. What resources are available to us today in order to better equip ourselves as a society about dealing with mental illness? Works cited. Music used.